Fog clung to the narrow streets of Hollow's End like a suffocating shroud, muffling the faint sound of footsteps and whispers that no one dared to acknowledge. The town had always been small, the kind of place travelers passed through with hurried steps, sensing something unspoken, lurking in its quiet corners. Even in the middle of the day, shadows seemed to stretch too long, bending unnaturally, as if the sun itself feared to illuminate the secrets buried beneath the cobblestones. Eleanor had arrived at Hollow's End on an autumn evening, drawn by rumors of the vanished and the unexplained. She had heard the stories whispered in smoky taverns far away, tales of a manor at the edge of the forest where those who entered were never seen again. Driven by curiosity, and perhaps by a darker, unnameable compulsion, she ignored the warnings of the villagers, whose eyes always flicked toward the forest whenever the manor was mentioned, their lips tightening into thin, fearful lines. The manor rose abruptly from the trees, blackened timber and jagged rooftops clawing at the sky. A cold wind swept from its broken windows, carrying with it the smell of decay and something fouler, a scent that made Eleanor's skin crawl. The front door, gnarled and scarred as if resisting the passage of time itself, creaked open at her touch, revealing a darkness so complete that it seemed to swallow the light from her lantern. She stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under her weight, echoing like the moans of long-forgotten souls. Inside, the air was thick, heavy with dust, and the faint metallic tang of blood, long dried. Portraits lined the walls, their eyes painted with such meticulous realism that Eleanor felt them follow her every movement. She tried to focus on the task at hand, the exploration, the thrill. But her chest tightened, her breath coming in shallow, frantic bursts. From the corner of her vision she glimpsed movement, a shadow darting across the hallway. But when she turned, nothing was there. Hours passed, or maybe only minutes. Time seemed to warp within the manor. Every step Eleanor took echoed with a mocking rhythm, and the whispers began, low, sibilant, curling around her ears. They spoke in voices that were not quite human, murmuring her name, laughing when she froze in terror. She could not tell if the sound came from the walls, the floor, or some unseen presence that hovered just beyond her perception. In the center of the manor, she found a library, a cavernous room lined with shelves of leather-bound tomes, their spines cracked with age. On a solitary pedestal lay a journal, its cover blackened and worn. As she opened it, the pages crackled like dry leaves, and she realized the handwriting inside was jagged, almost frantic, as if the author had scrawled it in a final, desperate moment. The words told of a presence, a being older than the town itself, that fed on fear and whispered promises of power to anyone foolish enough to listen. Those who sought it vanished, their minds unraveling before their bodies followed, swallowed by shadows that had no shape, but infinite hunger. A sudden chill passed through Eleanor, and the candle she held flickered violently, casting grotesque shapes against the walls. She heard it then, the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, approaching from behind. She spun around, but the hall was empty, yet the weight of unseen eyes bore down on her. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, promising her the knowledge of things no living soul should know. Panic surged, but curiosity rooted her in place. The journal trembled in her hands, and the ink seemed to writhe on the page, forming symbols she had never seen before, glowing faintly, as if alive. A shadow detached itself from the darkness, stretching impossibly tall, faceless, and yet Eleanor felt it was looking directly at her. It moved closer without sound, and the room temperature plummeted, frost forming on the edges of the books. Her lantern flickered and died, leaving her in absolute darkness, the whispering now a chorus, 1,000 voices calling her name, promising both revelation and obliteration. Eleanor stumbled back, tripping over a rug that seemed to have shifted beneath her feet and fell against the pedestal. The journal flipped open to a page she had not yet seen, and the words leapt off the paper like black flames, curling around her mind, sinking into her thoughts. She screamed, but the sound was swallowed, leaving only the whispers, the laughter, and the cold, endless gaze of something that had been waiting for centuries. The next morning, the villagers found the manor silent, its doors locked tight, as if no one had touched them. Inside, the library was undisturbed, the journal lying open on the pedestal. But Eleanor was gone. The whispers had claimed her, leaving behind only the faint scent of decay and the certainty that Hollow's End had swallowed yet another soul into its eternal shadow. And in the stillness, if one listened closely, the whispers continued, beckoning the next curious traveler to follow the same path, promising knowledge, terror, and the kind of fear that never truly ends. The town's silence after Eleanor's disappearance was unnatural, a heavy, suffocating quiet that settled over Hollow's End like a blanket soaked in shadow. Those who dared walk the streets at night reported strange shapes slipping through the fog, elongated and silent, their movements almost liquid in their smooth, impossible glide. Windows flickered with unexplainable shadows, and the faint smell of rot seemed to seep from the ground itself, curling through the alleys and doorways like a living thing. No one spoke of Eleanor. It was as if even mentioning her name could summon the darkness she had vanished into. Children were warned to stay indoors after sunset, and travelers were directed along alternate routes, advised to avoid the town entirely. But curiosity, as it often does, proved stronger than fear, and rumors of the manor persisted, drawing the foolish and the brave alike. Inside the manor, the atmosphere had shifted. The darkness no longer felt passive. It was aware, expectant, as though it had tasted freedom through Eleanor's fear and would not be satisfied until it had drawn more souls into its grasp. The whispers continued endlessly, threading through the walls, brushing against the ears of anyone who entered, promising secrets, power, and unimaginable knowledge. Those who stayed too long began to lose track of time. Minutes stretched into hours, hours into days, and the line between reality and the shadows blurred. Visitors reported seeing figures standing silently at the end of corridors, impossible shapes that faded when approached, leaving only the echo of a whisper and the faintest scent of something old and unholy. The walls seemed to breathe, swelling and contracting as though the house itself were alive, feeding on fear, on the terror of those who dared to walk its floors. One night, a traveler named Marcus arrived, a historian by trade and a skeptic by nature. He had heard the stories and dismissed them as folklore, a convenient tale for a town desperate to remain unseen. But curiosity drew him to the manor, to the same hallways Eleanor had walked. The air inside was thick, oppressive, and Marcus immediately felt a weight on his chest, as if unseen hands pressed down on him, urging him to turn back. Yet he pressed on, compelled by a mix of disbelief and a hidden hunger for proof. The portraits on the walls seemed to watch him, their painted eyes glinting in the faint light of his lantern. He felt their gaze not just follow him, but pierce into him, reading his thoughts, discerning his fears. A cold wind rushed past, carrying a soft, sibilant whisper. "Do you wish to know?" Marcus froze, every instinct screaming at him to flee. But the lure of the unknown was irresistible. He followed the whispers into the library, where the journal Eleanor had discovered lay open on its pedestal. Its pages trembled as if alive, ink shimmering and writhing in patterns that defied comprehension. Marcus felt a pull, magnetic and insistent, drawing him closer. The words on the pages seemed to seep into his mind, images forming in his consciousness, twisted figures lurking in the corners of his vision, long-forgotten horrors stirring from the depths of the earth, eyes that were not eyes watching him from beyond. A sound made him whip around, heart hammering. A figure emerged from the darkness, a shape taller than any human, faceless, with limbs that bent at impossible angles. Marcus could not move, could not speak. The entity's presence filled the room, pressing down with a cold so intense it burned through his very bones. The whispers became a chorus, urging, laughing, crying, merging into a single terrifying consciousness that sought to consume him. He tried to run, but the floor shifted beneath him, elongating the hallway endlessly. Doors led to nowhere, windows opened into walls of impenetrable darkness. Every attempt at escape was futile. The house had become a labyrinth, alive, feeding on his fear. The journal floated from the pedestal, pages flipping violently as though possessed. Words crawled across the parchment, forming themselves into threats, prophecies, and commands. Marcus screamed, but the sound dissolved into the suffocating silence, leaving him alone with the presence that had been waiting for centuries. Days passed, or was it hours? Marcus could no longer tell. The manor reshaped itself, corridors stretching and folding, shadows moving independently of any light. He caught glimpses of Eleanor, pale and hollow-eyed, wandering endlessly, her mind consumed by the whispers. She turned to him, expression vacant, and he realized with horror that she was no longer truly human, a vessel for the darkness that haunted Hollow's End. The entity approached, faceless and infinite, and Marcus felt his consciousness fraying at the edges, the whispers sinking into his thoughts like black ice. Desperation clawed at him, but the manor would not release him. He understood, in the final moments before the shadows engulfed him completely, that the house was not just a building. It was a sentient hunger, patient and eternal, thriving on curiosity, fear, and the fragile grip humans had on their own sanity. Outside, Hollow's End remained calm, deceptively peaceful, the fog curling through the streets like a slow-moving river. Travelers whispered warnings, and the town's few remaining residents kept their eyes down, ears attuned to the slightest hint of movement. But the manor waited, its windows dark, its doors closed, hiding its true nature. And in the silence, if one listened closely, the faintest of whispers could be heard, curling around the mind like smoke. "Do you wish to know?" Those who answered were never seen again. The shadows continued to spread, seeping into dreams, into the edges of perception, whispering secrets no mortal should possess. And somewhere inside the manor, Eleanor and Marcus wandered endlessly, consumed by the darkness, their minds lost but their fears preserved, feeding the hunger of a presence older than memory, patient as the grave, eternal as the night. And Hollow's End remained, waiting for the next curious soul, foolish enough to step into the fog, drawn by whispers, drawn by the promise of knowledge, drawn by the irresistible pull of something that should never be known. The fog outside grew thicker with each passing night, curling around the manor like fingers seeking entrance. Even from the town, the building seemed to pulse, as though breathing slowly, waiting. No birds sang near Hollow's End, and the wind carried a faint, low moan that chilled the marrow. Windows rattled on still nights, though no storm ever came. The locals, now few in number, avoided the manor entirely, speaking only in whispers of those foolish enough to enter, their words trembling with fear. Inside, the manor seemed to anticipate every movement of its new captives. Eleanor's eyes, hollow and vacant, followed Marcus as he wandered the warped hallways. The shadows moved independently, forming shapes that were almost human, almost not. Their faces were blurred, yet familiar, like memories half remembered and twisted into nightmares. Marcus could feel them crawling along his skin, brushing his hair, wrapping around his consciousness. Every door he opened led to a new horror, a room filled with hundreds of portraits whose eyes seemed to bleed, a dining hall where chairs moved as though occupied, a grand staircase that led to an endless void. The whispers never ceased. They spoke in languages Marcus could not recognize, yet he understood every word. They promised him power, secrets, visions beyond mortal comprehension. They told him he could be free, but only if he offered his mind, his soul. He tried to resist, but the walls seemed to lean closer, the shadows thickening until there was no distinction between floor and ceiling, no distinction between himself and the darkness surrounding him. Then he saw her, Eleanor, standing at the far end of a hallway that seemed impossibly long, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. She smiled, a thin, unnatural curve of lips that promised both familiarity and horror. "They told me everything," she whispered, her voice not her own, layered with echoes of hundreds of others. "And now they are yours." Marcus ran, but the manor had changed. Hallways twisted, doors vanished, and windows opened only to reveal walls of shadow. In every reflection he saw hundreds of eyes staring back at him, faces of people who had vanished long ago, their mouths open in silent screams. The journal floated toward him, pages flipping violently, words burning into his mind, forming visions he could not unsee. Bodies hung from invisible hooks, faces melting into darkness, whispers that clawed at the edges of sanity. The shadows began to take form, solidifying into shapes that defied logic. Limbs elongated impossibly, heads twisted in impossible angles, eyes multiplied across their faces. They advanced silently, gliding over the floor with a grace that was impossible for flesh. Marcus tried to fight, but there was no resistance. Each attempt to push them back only made them more real, more present, as if the manor fed on his fear, growing stronger with every heartbeat. A sudden realization gripped him. There was no escape. The manor was alive, a predator, and he was its prey. Every scream, every struggle, every act of defiance was anticipated and consumed. His mind began to fracture, visions bleeding into reality, walls breathing, floors melting, ceilings dripping with black ichor. Eleanor appeared again, now merging with the shadows, a single entity that towered over him. She reached out, not with hands, but with darkness itself, tendrils of shadow wrapping around his chest, crushing the air from his lungs. Marcus fell to the floor, gasping, his mind splitting under the weight of fear. The whispers rose into a chorus, chanting his name, speaking of eternity, of knowledge too vast for any human mind, of pleasures and horrors intertwined. The walls of the manor seemed to warp into a single, endless room filled with eyes, mouths, and impossible shapes. He felt his body dissolve, his identity dissolving, until all that remained was awareness, a consciousness floating in a sea of darkness, endlessly observed, endlessly consumed. Outside, Hollow's End remained untouched by time, the fog thickening, the town silent. Travelers occasionally glimpsed figures in the windows of the manor, pale and motionless, but when they approached, the windows were empty. The whispers could be heard faintly on still nights, calling to those who dared listen. They spoke of the manor, of the power within, and of the inevitable fate awaiting anyone foolish enough to seek it. The town's legends grew, feeding the manor's hunger. Each tale told around fires and in taverns became part of its essence, weaving the fears of the living into the fabric of its being. The manor's presence extended beyond its walls, seeping into the surrounding forest, into dreams, into the minds of anyone who heard its story. Curiosity became a curse, and fear a key that unlocked the endless halls of shadow. And somewhere deep within, Eleanor and Marcus remained. Not alive, not dead, not human. They were vessels now, conduits for the darkness, wandering through corridors that shifted like water, endlessly drawn to whispers, to promises, to the knowledge that had destroyed them. Their minds were fragments, their thoughts twisted into loops of terror and awe, and yet, in the deepest part of the darkness, they understood a truth. The manor would never release them. Not now, not ever. Outside, the wind moaned through Hollow's End, carrying faint echoes of laughter, of whispers, of footsteps that were not there. The town slept, or pretended to, while the manor waited. It waited for the next soul, the next curious mind, the next foolish heart, willing to seek what should remain, forever unknown. And if one listened closely, when the fog pressed against the town, and the night was deepest, they could hear it. "Do you wish to know?" Those who answered were gone, their minds consumed, their fears eternal, leaving only the faintest trace, a whisper, a shadow, a chill that promised the darkness was patient, infinite, and always hungry. Hollow's End endured, quiet and waiting, a monument to curiosity and terror, to knowledge too vast, too dark for mortal minds. And so it would remain, as long as someone dared to step into the fog, drawn by the promise of secrets, drawn by the irresistible pull of something older than memory, older than the town itself, a darkness that whispered eternally, endlessly, to those who dared listen. The manor's presence extended beyond its walls, seeping into the minds of those who dared speak of it. At night, villagers reported dreams filled with shadowy corridors, whispering voices, and glimpses of figures that vanished when approached. People who had never stepped foot in Hollow's End awoke drenched in sweat, hearts pounding, haunted by visions of a towering, faceless entity and a pale woman wandering endless hallways. The whispers carried promises that were never meant to be fulfilled. Power, secrets, knowledge, but they always demanded a price, a surrender of the mind, a step into madness from which there was no return. Marcus's existence became a cycle of terror and fleeting lucidity. Within the manor, corridors shifted continuously, leading him to rooms he had never seen, each more grotesque than the last. Portraits of previous victims lined the walls, their eyes following his every movement. Sometimes he could swear he heard Eleanor's voice calling his name softly, coaxing him deeper into the darkness. Other times, the whispers attacked him directly, hissing words of despair and threats in a language older than memory. The shadows began to take on more defined forms, emerging as twisted reflections of human shapes, each one more horrifying than the last. Limbs bent in impossible directions, faces merged and split, mouths open to release sounds that should not exist. They glided silently, surrounding Marcus, tightening a cage of darkness that seemed alive, responding to his fear. The more he tried to flee, the more the manor restructured itself. Hallways stretching infinitely, staircases curling back upon themselves, doors leading to ceilings or walls, trapping him in a labyrinth of shadow. Marcus stumbled upon a room where the walls were covered in ancient, indecipherable symbols. A faint glow emanated from the markings, pulsating like a heartbeat, and he felt an irresistible pull, as if the symbols were reaching into his mind, weaving his thoughts into patterns of terror. The journal Eleanor had discovered floated into the center of the room, pages fluttering violently. Words leapt off the paper, forming shapes in the air that shimmered like living shadows. Marcus could hear them calling, laughing, crying, whispering secrets of horrors that existed beyond the comprehension of any mortal mind. Suddenly, the temperature plunged, frost forming on his skin as a suffocating weight pressed down on him. The faceless entity materialized before him, impossibly tall, its form rippling like smoke and solid at the same time. Eleanor appeared beside it, her body merging with the darkness, a grin stretching unnaturally across her pale face. They spoke in unison, their voices a chorus of the damned. You sought the truth. Now you belong to it. Marcus felt his consciousness fraying, memories unraveling, reality twisting into a nightmare from which he could not wake. The shadows extended, coiling around him, whispering promises of eternity, visions of knowledge too vast, too dark to survive. Every thought, every emotion was consumed by the darkness, and yet, in the midst of terror, he glimpsed understanding. The manor was not merely a place, but a sentient force, patient and eternal, feeding on fear, curiosity, and the fragile human mind. Outside, the town remained in deceptive calm, the fog thick and suffocating. Hollow's End had become a magnet for stories of fear, tales whispered around fireplaces and in taverns, each one feeding the manor's hunger. Travelers who heard the stories could feel the pull, an inexplicable compulsion to seek the manor despite warnings, and those who did were never seen again, their fates absorbed into the shifting darkness, their minds joining the chorus of whispers that perpetually haunted the manor. Even the forest surrounding the manor was not untouched. Trees twisted unnaturally, branches reaching like skeletal hands toward the fog, leaves rustling with voices that promised secrets and whispered threats. Animals avoided the area entirely, their absence adding to the oppressive silence. The very land seemed corrupted, a reflection of the malevolent force dwelling within the manor, waiting for the next soul to wander too close, drawn by whispers, curiosity, or defiance. And somewhere inside, Eleanor and Marcus wandered eternally, not as people but as vessels, conduits for the darkness. Their awareness fragmented, their minds loops of terror and awe, yet a faint recognition lingered. They were now guardians of the manor, harbingers to any who dared approach. The whispers continued endlessly, promising the impossible and threatening the inevitable, binding all who listened to the eternal shadow that fed on fear and the inexhaustible human desire to know. The town slept beneath the fog, oblivious or perhaps unwilling to acknowledge the horror at its edge. The manor remained dark and patient, a constant reminder that some knowledge was never meant to be sought, some doors never meant to be opened, and if one listened closely on a still night, the whispers could still be heard, beckoning the next curious traveler to step into the fog, promising revelation, terror, and a fate that would bind them forever to the shadows of Hollow's End. The darkness within the manor began to shift, no longer content with shadows and whispers alone. Hallways warped like liquid, floors undulating beneath Marcus's feet, as if the house itself were a living, breathing predator. He stumbled into a room where the walls were slick, blackened, reflecting distorted versions of himself. His own face stared back from the surfaces, twisted in agony, screaming silently. Every step he took echoed with the cries of those long consumed, a chorus of lost souls etched into the manor's very foundation. Eleanor floated ahead, her movements gliding unnaturally, her eyes voids of pale luminescence. Each step she took left behind faint trails of shadow that writhed across the floor, curling like serpents, reaching out to Marcus with delicate, mocking tendrils. He tried to speak, to call her name, but the sound dissolved before it left his lips, as though the manor itself consumed the act of speech. The whispers rose in intensity, now a cacophony of hundreds, thousands of voices speaking in unison, a language older than memory, older than time itself. A sudden chill swept through the room, extinguishing the lantern Marcus had carried. Darkness engulfed him completely, and in that void he felt the manor's hunger press against his mind. Images flashed behind his eyelids, shadowy figures dragging him through endless corridors, hands breaking through walls to grasp his ankles, mouths forming in impossible places, screaming silently. He understood that these visions were not illusions. They were a premonition, a glimpse of the fate awaiting anyone who dared step inside. Eleanor turned to him then, her grin stretching impossibly wide. "Do you see now?" she whispered, her voice layered with hundreds of others. "Do you understand what it means to know?" Marcus's mind teetered on the brink, thoughts fracturing, reality dissolving. He tried to flee, but the manor refused, walls bent and twisted, forming corridors that had no end. Each attempt to escape led him deeper, past rooms that should not exist, filled with grotesque assemblies of eyes, bones, and faces pressed flat against the walls. In the center of this labyrinth, the journal appeared again, floating before him. The ink writhed across the pages, forming symbols that glowed faintly, pulsing in rhythm with a heartbeat he could feel in his chest. He understood, terrifyingly clearly, that the manor was not merely a building. It was a sentient force, older than any memory, feeding on the fear, curiosity, and despair of those who entered. The whispers spoke promises, power, secrets, visions beyond comprehension, but always demanded a price. Marcus realized he could never leave. His body and mind were already part of the manor, fragments woven into its eternal hunger. The faceless entity approached once more, taller, more solid, yet flickering with impossible motion. Its limbs twisted like smoke, coiling around the room, drawing Marcus's vision toward infinity. Eleanor merged fully with the darkness, her form dissolving into shadow, yet her voice remained, echoing from all directions. "There is no escape. You wanted to know. Now you are ours." Marcus felt his consciousness unravel. Thoughts scattered like leaves in a storm. He saw visions of Hollow's End consumed by the shadows, the town bending and twisting, villagers frozen in eternal silence, their fears feeding the manor as they slept unaware. He felt his identity fragmenting, his body dissolving into nothingness, leaving only awareness, a single point of terror drifting in an endless sea of darkness. The whispers consumed him entirely, and yet he understood, with horrific clarity, the terrible majesty of what he had sought. Knowledge that should never have been pursued, a truth beyond mortal reckoning. Outside, the town slept under a blanket of fog, oblivious to the horrors lurking at its edge. Travelers occasionally glimpsed pale, wandering figures in the manor's windows, sometimes with Marcus's face or Eleanor's twisted grin, but when approached, the rooms were empty. The whispers traveled on the wind, reaching even the farthest ears, carrying promises of power and knowledge, and luring the next foolhardy soul into the manor's grip. The manor's influence continued to grow, bleeding into the surrounding forest. Trees twisted unnaturally, their branches like claws, creaking in the fog with voices of the damned. Animals fled, fields grew barren, and even the river that ran past the town seemed to slow, its waters thick with shadow. Every story told about Hollow's End fed the manor's hunger. Every whispered legend added another layer to its eternal consciousness, until the town itself became an extension of the darkness within. Eleanor and Marcus wandered endlessly, not alive, not dead, but conduits for the shadows. They were aware, yet powerless, able only to witness new victims being drawn into the endless corridors. Their thoughts looped endlessly, fear, curiosity, despair, awe. They became guides, in a perverse sense, for the manor's next prey, eternally trapped, eternally part of the hunger that had claimed them. And so, Hollow's End endured, quiet, patient, waiting. Fog curled through the streets, thick and unyielding. Whispers rose on still nights, calling to those who dared listen. "Do you wish to know?" The few who answered never returned. Their fears, their curiosity, their very minds were absorbed, feeding the eternal darkness that watched, waited, and hungered, patient as centuries, infinite as the night itself. Somewhere inside, the manor shifted again. Corridors stretched, rooms appeared and disappeared, and the shadows moved with deliberate intent, testing, probing, waiting for the next visitor. Eleanor's pale figure flickered at the edges, whispering, beckoning, laughing with voices that were not hers alone. Marcus floated through the darkness beside her, mind shattered, yet aware enough to recognize that the manor's hunger would never be sated, that curiosity itself was the trap, and that anyone who dared to seek its secrets would vanish as surely as he had. The fog thickened, swallowing the town, swallowing the thoughts of those who watched from afar, carrying the whispers further, until they reached new ears, sparking curiosity and drawing the next soul into Hollow's End. And the manor waited, as it had for centuries, patient, infinite, eternal, a dark heart beating at the edge of perception, whispering, always whispering, "Do you wish to know?" As the fog pressed heavier on Hollow's End, the manor seemed to pulse with anticipation, sensing the culmination of its centuries-long patience. Inside, corridors twisted with impossible geometry, ceilings bending, and floors folding like liquid. Marcus and Eleanor drifted endlessly through this labyrinth, conduits of the darkness, witnessing horrors beyond mortal comprehension. Each room offered a new torment, walls that whispered your deepest fears aloud, mirrors that reflected futures never lived, and figures that mimicked friends and family, only to twist into grotesque parodies of humanity when approached. A sudden sound echoed through the halls, a low, resonant hum vibrating through the air, the floor, and the very bones of those trapped. The shadows thickened, coiling into shapes that seemed sentient, writhing toward Marcus and Eleanor. They realized with dawning horror that the manor was feeding not only on fear but on memory, extracting the very essence of those who entered, storing fragments of souls to perpetuate its consciousness. Every scream, every whispered thought became a thread woven into the dark fabric of the house, making it stronger, more cunning, more inescapable. In a room illuminated only by the faint glow of the journal's ink, Marcus saw visions that shattered his mind, endless corridors filled with missing travelers, faces frozen in silent screams, limbs bent in impossible ways, eyes that multiplied and stared, and Eleanor among them, grinning in recognition of the eternal hunger she now served. He felt himself unraveling further, his body and thoughts fragmenting, each piece consumed by the shadows. The whispers intensified, now a deafening chorus, promising power, knowledge, and understanding in exchange for submission. Eleanor's voice rose above the tumult, layered with hundreds of others. "You see now. You understand. There is no return." Marcus tried to resist, but the darkness was patient, infinite, relentless. Every memory of home, every thought of freedom dissolved into the void. He realized the truth. Curiosity was the key, fear the fuel, and the manor's hunger insatiable. It had claimed countless souls over centuries, each one now a part of its consciousness, guiding the next, teaching them the futility of escape. Suddenly, the floor beneath Marcus split into shadowy tendrils, pulling him downward. He screamed, a sound swallowed instantly by the suffocating blackness. Faces emerged from the walls, twisted and tormented, their mouths forming silent words. "You belong to us." He felt himself being absorbed, his essence stretching, fragmenting, merging with the eternal darkness. Eleanor drifted beside him, her eyes voids reflecting his fear, her smile eternal. Outside, Hollow's End remained untouched, deceptively peaceful. The fog enveloped the town, muffling sound, distorting shapes, creating illusions. Travelers passing near the forest reported whispers in the wind, voices beckoning, calling out secrets and forbidden knowledge. Some turned away in terror, others followed, vanishing, without a trace. The manor's hunger grew with each passing soul, its consciousness expanding into the fog, into the forest, into the very minds of those who dared to speak its name. Marcus felt his final fragment of awareness stretch infinitely into the darkness, realizing he had become part of the manor's eternal chorus. Eleanor's figure shimmered, fading into shadows, yet her voice lingered, entwined with hundreds of others, whispering, laughing, beckoning. The journal's pages fluttered, forming words in the air that burned into his mind. Curiosity is the key. Fear is the lock. Welcome to eternity. And so the manor endured, patient, infinite, eternal. Hollow's End slept beneath its fog, a town untouched in appearance, yet bound by a darkness older than memory. A darkness that fed on the living, whispered to the curious, and waited for the next soul foolish enough to seek knowledge it was never meant to have. The whispers continued on still nights, curling through the fog. Do you wish to know? And for those who answered, there was only the darkness, the eternal corridors, and the endless gaze of faceless eyes, watching, waiting, hungering. Forever. Hollow's End remained, as it always had, a monument to curiosity, fear, and the unspeakable hunger that lay at the edge of perception, a darkness that would never rest, never relent, and never let go.